I'm so short, I have to actually hold the microphone down. My name is Jess Fonzo. I'm faculty here at SICE as well as at the Berman Institute of Ethics in the Baltimore campus of Johns Hopkins. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bonnie McLafferty to SICE. Bonnie's a good friend first, colleague second. We've worked together for a long time on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. Bonnie is working at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, a very interesting organization. She leads the program that looks at the linkages between agriculture and nutrition, which was, at first people wondered, why is GAIN getting into agriculture? They only do fortification. But Bonnie has really grown the program. She has some really interesting projects that she's going to present today. Before that, Bonnie was at Harvest Plus. She was leading a lot of the communication work there. Harvest Plus is very well known for their biofortification program, mainly in working in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and she was there for a long time, as well as at IFPRI. She's a fantastic person, one of the warmest people I know in the nutrition community, which is a cantankerous bunch. And it's a great pleasure to have her here. So thanks, Bonnie. Thank you, Jeff. And I think we're getting you. Here's the microphone.
So, good morning, everyone. Maybe I would like to start. I was asked to give a presentation on market-based solutions for improved nutrition. And so, of course, I'm going to move into that presentation. But I thought I'd take a minute first to talk a little bit about GAIN, because it is a kind of a unique organization in the world of nutrition. So GAIN is a global alliance for improved nutrition. It was founded in 2002 with a very large contributions from both the bilateral donor community and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to be a single organization focusing on nutrition. We found, at least within the UN system, nutrition sat a little bit in FAO, a little bit in WHO. Of course, WFP did some work in it. But there was no one single organization that focused on nutrition, and in particular, the delivery side of nutrition. So not, if you look at the continuum from, sort of discovery and research and new interventions to the adaptation.
When you walk away, I will turn that one off.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, so adapting nutrition interventions, it really sits in delivery. It's saying, how can we get the proven interventions the last mile? And in doing so, it decidedly says we have to bring markets into the equation, and we need to bring the private sector, which was quite unusual for an NGO at the time. And as Jess had mentioned, we started with large-scale food fortification using a model whereby we brought the private sector with public money and government together through calls for proposals to fortify staples and fortify, we call it large-scale food fortification. We may know iodized salt is a good example of that. Obviously, fortified oils, fortified wheat, maize flour, these kinds of interventions, which can reach many millions of people at scale. And using that model of public-private partnerships, we've now, I think we've reached over 900 million people with fortified food products that have been generated and moved through that model. About 8 years ago, way before the 1,000 days, for those who work in nutrition, was coined the 1,000 days. Of course, GAIN was very much on the forefront of saying, look, we've really got to focus on moms, infants, and young children. So there was a whole series using the same model of public-private partnerships. It was looking at developing product that were nutritionally dense and met the nutritional requirements for the pregnant and lactating women and children under 2. So those products would include lipid-based nutrient supplements, fortified complementary foods, and micronutrient powders. So those are some good examples. About 5 years ago, I came from the CGIAR, IFPRI in particular, and my charge was to bring dietary diversity into the equation of what is nutrition. It's not a single product, as we all know, and we run into this very difficult conundrum where nutrition, which tends to work within life cycles, and agriculture, which tends to work along supply chains, crash into each other. So as we all know, and we've probably all heard, agriculture is around productivity. They measure success by increasing yields, and nutrition worries about the nutritional status of very particular age groups, and they don't that they don't know how to speak to one another. So agriculture is not about the quality of food, and nutrition, quite frankly, isn't about food. So we run into this dilemma, but we've been working through that. So what I'd like to do in this presentation, a little bit, get you oriented to nutrition, the burden of malnutrition, where food sits within nutrition, and some of the challenges we face. We'll talk, and then really start to look at this whole question of markets. Why should we deal with markets? Why, where's the private sector in all of this? Why should we be focusing on the private sector? And then give two examples of what we call solutions to try within the agriculture continuum, and actually it's the whole food system. I wouldn't want to stop in just agriculture, to try to unlock some of the barriers we have to gaining better access to an affordable, diversified diet. And then in the end, I want to talk a little bit about innovative finance, because I think the biggest challenge we're facing is bringing the unusual suspects to the table, not typically seen as nutritionists, not typically seen as nutrition intervention, and we will constantly crash into the availability of finance to be able to innovate in this world of market-based solutions for nutrition. So, with this gadget. Okay, so Jess, correct me if I'm wrong, and those in the room, but I don't think we've moved the needle too much on hidden hunger. Certainly when it comes to calories and hunger as defined by the 800 million, we've moved that a bit, and there's been quite success stories for some countries in particular. The Global Nutrition Report, which you're one of the authors on, has some great numbers in there. But there are essentially 2 billion people in the world who suffer from what we call hidden hunger. We know that these are micronutrient malnutrition. They're often invisible. This is the iron deficiency, the zinc deficiency, the vitamin A deficiency. It's an enormous number of individuals, and it's the consequences of this result in some irreversible damage of cognitive development in children, for example. Anemia is probably the largest burden that we have for malnutrition. Anemia affects most women, or upwards of, 80% of some women in reproductive age in many developing countries. And it's having a huge impact on the global burden of disease. 50%, or even a little bit more than 50% of all mortality has an underlying cause of malnutrition associated with it. So this problem is enormous, and what can we do at GAIN or elsewhere to try to have an impact? So what you have on the right-hand side are some of the two main areas that nutrition tends to focus when it comes to children, women of reproductive age, and entire populations, which is there is a food piece to malnutrition, certainly, but there's an infection and disease piece as well. And they're often seen, Jess, can I help? But they're often seen separate, but in fact we know there's a lot of link, particularly in the food production system, to disease and infection. So there's a lot of movement this way. But the world that we begin to work in, or I'm trying to focus on, is this whole world of food and nutrient intake and food availability and affordability. Because for diversifying the diet, the availability of diverse foods and the affordability of diverse foods are what's inhibiting the uptake and the consumption of those foods. So as I had said earlier, some of the challenges we face is that nutrition efforts have largely taken a sort of a therapeutic mindset. Children are undernourished, treat them. Don't necessarily prevent, treat. So this is where you get a lot of treatment regimes, sort of a medical model where nutrition sits. And then agriculture provides food, but it's not looking at the quality of that food. So as I had mentioned earlier, that's one of our biggest challenges. I've been trying to do this now for nearly 20 years, and I think we've moved the needle. I think we have things like the Feed the Future initiative at USAID, which is actually quite powerful in bringing nutrition closer to agriculture, and with the private sector lens on it, I think it has had some great progress. But one of the things we recognize in agriculture is people actually don't eat a crop, and they don't eat a nutrient. They eat diets. And so to get nutritionists to think about diets, to get agriculturalists to produce to a diet, this is our big challenge. The poor will eat largely staples. Staples will make up 80% of the diet. We know there's nothing in them, or very little. So the challenge is to augment those, but at the same time tackle this issue of the availability and affordability of a more diverse basket of foods. So that the quality diets are neither accessible or affordable. And in fact, one of the big challenges, nutrition just doesn't sell. So if you want to bring the private sector to the table, the question really is how much can nutrition drive markets and a private sector agenda? But to get to scale with nutritious diets for the largest numbers, we do need to look at this market piece and the role that the private sector can play. So why even pay attention to markets and the private sector? Well, let's just note that the private sector dominates food availability, right? So the private sector investment accounts for nearly 70% of all total global agricultural food investments. And then the public sector funding takes up the remainder. In 2050, the private sector investment is expected to increase by 50% by 2050 and up to $200 billion annually. The private sector investment is essential to feed 9.5 billion. That's where we're going. Everybody's trying to hit the 9.5. How are we going to feed 9.5 billion people and feed them adequately? I spent a bit of time at the World Bank under a program called the GAFSP program, and we had to do an analysis of the need, the investment need to reach that 9.5 billion. And I think FAO came up with a number and the bank came up with about 84 billion a year investment that's going to be needed. And when we put all the numbers together, we could come up with 7 billion from the public sector. So what's going to fill that gap? And it was very clear that we've got to get national government's budgets, obviously, could be dedicated to that, but the private sector has got to fill some of this gap. So the demand, we also know that the demand for foods will need to grow by 70%. And I just gave that statistic about the 80 billion per year. So we've got to be able to look toward other sources of funding. But the final reason is, why pay attention to markets in the private sector? Well, it's because where the poor are sourcing their foods, right? I mean, everybody thinks farmers, that this is what everybody's doing, right? The rural people, this is where they're sourcing their foods. In fact, farmers are net purchasers of food. They're net purchasers of food. So this is what your rural markets are looking like. This is where the poor are sourcing their foods. This is all private sector. These are all markets. And even this person would love to have a market for their products. So how do we bring the private sector to to the investment table for something that really does not sell? That's a big challenge. So we use the supply chain, and we recognize who all these actors are. And the real challenge here is to align the incentives to either improve market share or reduce cost. So it's a real tricky lineup, right? So the private sector, you're going to have to improve the share of the market or reduce cost, and doing it to promote nutrition. I've got a couple ideas on how we do that. I would love to brainstorm with everyone here to see how we do that. I'll share one story where we were doing that in Bangladesh with the rice value chain. But we know all the way through the supply chain, we have actors who are all private sector, from the seed companies to the fertilizer companies to the pesticides, irrigation equipment, farming practices, post-harvest techniques, home storage, warehouse, industrial food storage, bulking, packaging, transport, all the way through the point of consumption. The actors have to be incentivized, and most of them are private sector. So before I go to the marketplace for nutritious foods, which I think was the reason you really wanted me to highlight here, which is I think a really interesting engine, I do want to give an example of aligning incentives. In Bangladesh, the rice value chain, 80% of the diet is rice for most of the poor. But rice is notoriously difficult to fortify. It's very, very difficult. And in Bangladesh in particular, you have parboiled rice. And white rice is paramount. Everything should be white. And it's washed and washed and washed and washed, and then parboiled. So we were trying to look at a way to fortified rice affordably. And we looked all the way from to increase the nutritional density of the rice, we looked at the inputs. So there, of course, were biofortified seeds, where you have a high zinc variety of rice. You've got golden rices. You've got opportunities to make the inputs into the farming system more nutritious. And then as you start to move through the supply chain, the next point of entry for fortifying or making rice more nutritious is this whole processing space. And so we tested varying the parboiling temperature, parboiling time, and the milling rate. So the amount of time that, the extent to which the rice is milled and all of the, the nutrients are taken off. And even if you were to modify that by 5 or 10%, what would that do to the nutritional quality of the rice itself? And we found that the millers were some of our biggest champions in the modification of the milling technique, which would surprise people. But it's because they could reduce their costs, right? The milling itself was expensive. If they could reduce it by 5%, 7%, and market it as more nutritious, it was a win-win for them. So that's an example of where one has to align the incentives of business for pro-nutrition. And that's the way we think of this at Gain. So mostly I'd like to take this time to talk about 2 initiatives we have going at Gain. One is the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods. The Marketplace for Nutritious Foods is indeed a brainchild of the Feed the Future initiative. They were the host and the source of funding to develop the Marketplace and to roll it out. The Marketplace for Nutritious Foods sits in Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, Rwanda, and hopefully next year in Ghana. It is a platform for market-based solutions for the base of the pyramid. It improves the access of nutritious foods for base of the pyramid consumers, especially women and children. It catalyzes and funds innovations in nutritious food products and solutions targeted at base of the pyramid consumers, and it provides donors, investors, and Gain with investable opportunities. So it is an incubator. It's an innovation incubator for nutritious foods in these challenging populations. Now, the reason we came up with the idea of the Marketplace for Nutritious Food is because we were finding that this accessibility issue was a huge pinch point to the availability of these nutritious foods. There simply weren't enough businesses engaged in nutritious food development. And there still isn't, but we are having quite the impact so far. It's all looking pretty good. But there are some critical elements to what is the Marketplace. First, we have a community of practice of businesses. And this is, in Kenya, we have about 400 companies. In Mozambique, we have about 260 companies. In Tanzania, we have about 100 companies. And Rwanda is just getting off the ground with somewhere around 100 companies as well. But this community of practice is where companies will get together. They'll share information. And these are small and medium scale enterprises. We're not talking about big companies here, and they're all local. And I think what you find is there's a really great exchange among them. Investors see when multiple companies can get together, they have a pipeline. They have a source of many different opportunities. So investors come into the community of practice. We have government officials who come in because these companies are saying, you're imposing regulations on our food system. We knock on the door of the bureaus of standard and nobody's home. We want to have an exchange with you as to what is stopping us from getting nutritious foods into market. So it's a really nice opportunity to engage with government also. They all have communications tools, so they have Facebook pages and they have all kinds of social media and their own websites. The community of practice, 2 to 3 times a year, will hold a call for proposals of its membership. And that's what we call the Innovation Accelerator. The calls for proposals will go out. Companies submit the proposals. We vet them. We screen them. We have to test for the viability of the company itself, so there's a lot of time in the field to make sure these companies actually exist. We put them through a local technical advisory committee made up of nutritionists, agriculturalists, again, the finance piece, and we are able to screen out those we think that will have the largest impact as soon as possible. So here we're not talking about innovations at the very nascent stage. These are companies that are investable. So you'll see there's a continuum that that I'll show later on of where exactly these sit, and I'll get to that in a minute. So once we're able to sift through the proposals, we then award the first award to the top 10 to 15, which is a marketable business plan. These companies don't have bankable documents to go to for further investment. So we, GAIN, a nutrition organization, spends time building business plans for these companies. And we invest a considerable amount of time in that. And we do it with the guidance of banks as well. So what kind of information are they going to need in order to go to the point of investment? The business planning tells us where there's actually a hole that needs to be filled with cash. So we provide a grant. A first-time grant is at 100%, and then it's 50% later on if they want follow-on grants where they have to put skin in the game. So that's the Innovation Accelerator. The access to finance is a big piece, and I'll talk a little bit about access to finance in a minute. But we are looking, and it's constantly being built. This, again, I'm going to highlight later, is the challenge, is this access to finance to this very tricky group of companies that are considered quite risky. So this community of practice, now I get the numbers in, we have over 2,000 registered members across these countries. There is a lot of learning and sharing. There's trainings that take place. We have a lot of guest speakers, networking opportunities, all looking to address the constraints to getting nutritious foods in the market. Again, I just explained our sort of innovation accelerator. We have our calls for proposals, the business valuation, and then we make the investments. And we provide technical assistance as part of those investments. Now, the technical assistance sometimes is business planning. Sometimes it's in food safety. We do a lot of food safety technical assistance with these products. We do a lot of labeling and marketing. Oftentimes, we'll get proposals in and there's not a marketing strategy. So we will have to top up the grant to be doing marketing strategies. A lot of regulatory compliance, depending upon the country. So we provide all kinds of technical assistance. So here's some examples. Now, these are not highly processed foods, most cases. In the case of Mozambique, we've funded VegMan, which is a vertically integrated supply facility for vegetables. This is a guy who's not only go from production, but he goes all the way up through retail. We've given him a grant to increase his productivity capacity, pumps, electricity, greenhouses, et cetera. And the construction of a new retail outlet as well. So this is a vertically integrated vegetable vendor, all the way from production through retail. Chicken Choice. Chicken Choice is located in the outskirts of Kibera in Nairobi. It is, Chicken Choice is a set of small kiosks and shops. It's a very interesting story. The fellow who runs Chicken Choice, Eric, worked for one of the largest poultry manufacturers in Kenya called Ken Chick. And he was noticing, he's also a public health, he's trained in public health, but he was working in the facility, the chicken processing facility. And he was noticing in the back of the facility that women were coming at night and collecting all of the byproduct, the offal, the neck, the beaks, the feet, the livers, the hearts, all of these foods, and it was highly unsanitary. So the public health person in him kicked in, and he said, you know what, there's a market for those products for base of the pyramid. So he started what he calls Chicken Choice, which provides very clean supply of affordable, on-demand chicken part. And they're awful, right? They're the beaks, the necks, the innards. He operates along the entire poultry value chain, so he has a chick facility that's his own, but he goes all the way up through processing. Now with the marketplace grant, he had 3 kiosks when he started. He's up to, I believe, 11 now outside of Kibera. And I went and visited. I spent several days at some of these. And I started asking the consumers, what are you doing with this? Some women were buying, sacks of feet, which are onward businesses that they were doing. And so the spin-off of starting to do a little distribution system like that has all kinds of difficult impact evaluation questions. but it is providing affordable chicken pieces into the diet that never would have been there. He's sold 156 metric tons of chicken within the Nairobi slums over the last 12 months. This shows you how quickly these market-based approaches can move. And Chicken Choice is up to expand. They now have Root Capital as an investor coming in, as another investor, and not just relying on the GAIN grant. This is another extremely innovative company. This is a full-fat milk dispensing units. If you're poor, you have 10 shillings, and you have no refrigeration in the slums. You need to be able to go and take your 10 shillings and on demand purchase as much milk as your family can get for the day. What these milk dispensing units allow are families to do just that. And again, it's in the slums. This is an enormous and interesting innovation. It's clean, it's pasteurized, and it provides fresh and clean milk on demand for those communities. So you can, the smallest unit I think is 65, it's 0.5 US cents worth of milk per dispense. We gave them a grant to increase their productive capacity, a pasteurization facility, a truck, and laboratory equipment to test. They've sold so far 55,000 liters in the first 3 months of our grant. So measuring impact is a bit of a challenge. At this point in time, what we're capturing is we're not going into the households to see what this has done to micronutrient status or intake, but we are able to measure portions based on sales. So far in Kenya, with the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods Investments, we have over 3.5 million extra servings of nutritious foods in the market, and that's within 2 years. And in Mozambique, we have 4.5 million servings of nutritious foods in the market. It shows you the power of using a market-based approach to move foods. What you can see on the right, or what you can't see on the right, are some other examples of other investments we've made. In Mozambique, there have been some vertical integration. The vegetables have increased the availability of squash and spinach and pumpkins and peppers and lettuce and Chinese cabbage, beetroot, banana, tomato, peanut butter product, fortified peanut butter products, goat product, and a couple soy-based products. So that's the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods. So in this case, what I wanted to illustrate is the power of being able to stimulate, support small and medium-scale enterprises to diversify the diet using market-based approaches. The second one, which is a little bit hot off the shelf and under development, but I wanted to share it, is a new solution we're developing around post-harvest loss and waste of nutritious foods. And I think just as an introduction, the data is showing us that in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, over 50% of fruits and vegetables are lost due to post-harvest loss and waste. These numbers are debatable. I think there's new numbers out of Michigan State that will tell you otherwise, but it's very difficult to get these numbers. I mean, people look at potato or they look at rice. What we're interested in is the horticultural products. And what we're seeing, and I think this is really interesting, is the profile of loss and waste in a sub-Saharan Africa or an Asia versus the United States, for example. So you're seeing at the production phase in sub-Saharan Africa, you don't have so much loss as in North America, which I find surprising. But what you see is in the United States, a lot of loss happening at retail, right? And not so much when it comes to Africa and Asia. People are just basically not wasting the food at this point in time. But there is a lot of loss from handling and storage to processing and packaging and through distribution. So you have most of your big blips in loss taking place right here in the middle of the supply chain. So for GAIN, we take a look at this and say, where is the pinch point in getting more fruits and vegetables accessible and affordable? Well, it's this loss. Loss is huge. So what can we do to try to stimulate and stop the loss and waste? And so what we've developed is this alliance that will build an ecosystem for small and local, medium local businesses in particular countries that looks to bring in technology solutions and technical assistance to reduce post-harvest loss and waste of nutritious foods. We have local businesses that are partnering with industry leaders in the cooling and cold chain sectors, in packaging and processing, and packaging and crating, and the last one is processing. Now, processing, we're not just talking about more processing facilities. What we're seeing as the critical intervention is to bring processors closer to farmers. I was just in Nigeria last week, looking at the tomato supply chain. Tomatoes, of course, are high in vitamin C. They have lots of vitamin A. They're actually a really good source of nutrition. We're also looking at mangoes, which we all know is great for vitamin A. And we're saying we've basically followed the tomato. And if you go from the tomato production sites, you've got processing taking place outside of Lagos. And it travels 800 kilometers, tomatoes, in a basket, stacked, in order to get to the processing facilities. Most tomatoes are actually consumed fresh, but again, the crating is an enormous challenge because these tomatoes, they're picked they're picked ripe, and they get loaded into baskets, put on a big lorry, taken down the highway on very sketchy roads, and most of it is lost en route. So what we're doing is linking cooling and cold chain companies in the United States and Europe with local businesses in Nigeria that want to bring on either technical assistance and or new technologies. There's some core principles we're putting in place around food safety, also around climate smart technologies, not exporting kind of old technologies, but really looking at what can be new. There are research partners. There's a lot of questions in how we're going to measure impact on this. There's a lot of good folks out there, including a lot of U.S. institutions and U.S. universities that are looking at food loss and waste and using this as a platform. They want to kind of get data and measurement out of this. As I said, food safety experts, USDA is the technical lead on the food safety piece to provide food safety training to this business-to-business relationship. We've got anchored in local government. We have to, of course, government has to take the lead in these solutions and look to and have them as part of their policy agenda. But what I'd like to focus on, and for the last part of this presentation, is really this whole idea around financial institutions and how critical it is that they're coming on at the very beginning. There's an interesting, if you haven't read it, there's a great paper produced by Monitor, who's no longer, called From Blueprint to Scale. So anybody who's worked in development and in the world of financing takes a real look at how do we finance and how do we get innovation moving. And any single innovation, whether it's the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods or the Postharvest Loss and Waste Facility or any kind of new technology development, goes through various stages. The blueprint stage is where you understand your customer need. You do a lot of the design of whatever your intervention is. You look at your initial customer propositions, you develop your business plans, et cetera. It's very early stage innovation. But then once you have that idea, the blueprint, it has to be validated, right? You got to get your proof of concept that this business or this innovation will actually work. Then you actually, what they say is, they call it prepare, but this is taking it beyond validation to actually, to trial, and then it goes to scale. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that every stage requires different funding, a different type of financing. This can be purely private investment. There's no sense necessarily in spending public money to go to scale because you've proven the intervention. This is purely public, way too risky for a lot of the private investment. So what we've found is whether it's the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods or whether it's the Post-Harvest Loss and Waste Facility, it is this blended financing that's critical. And it's using public money smartly to unlock private investment. So circling back to the beginning of the presentation, this is where we have to use public money smartly to unlock that gap that we're going to have to feed 9.5 billion. We have to be able to say, how can we nudge private finance, private investment, much more toward public need? And I think that's where we're going to have to be creative. So students in this area, I would have you very carefully think about how do we start financing this and how do we look to use blended finance to unlock private investment and get the most for nutrition and health and some of these other challenges we have in feeding to 9.5 billion people. Thanks. Sure.
Please introduce yourself. Introduce yourself and where you're from.
Okay, Emmy Simmons, Global Panel on Ag and Food Systems for Nutrition. I was struck by your comment that agriculture is about sort of products and value chain, and that what you were trying to do was diversity of diets. And yet, as you talked about tomatoes, it was very much a value chain approach.
Right.
How do you get to the next step, which is kind of looking at sort of strategic support, presumably from GAIN's side or from USAID's side, for a diversity of products that are thereby going to contribute to dietary diversity? How are you going to make that next step?
Okay, no, really good question. So, Emmy, I use tomato because at GAIN, of course, we're being held responsible. Sorry, I'm trying to grab the mic. We're being held. I have to be accountable to the nutritional impact, right? So you do that by commodity. But in fact, when you look at the interventions themselves, cold chain and cooling, packaging and crating, these technologies are not crop specific, right? So if you get a warehouse company in the United States that says, we want to link up with a Nigerian warehouse, they're not building a warehouse for tomato. They're building a facility that can have different cooling temperatures to do a whole host of nutritious fruits and vegetables. So we use tomato as a proxy, but in fact, the facilities themselves are not commodity specific. There's no business in any single commodity warehouse, right? So the US companies are saying, we can go ahead and set up a warehouse, but you're going to want to load a lot of different product in it. And so we'll set it up to have different cooling temperature rooms. So it's that kind of, the technologies themselves are not crop specific. Yeah?
My name's Kat Cooley. I'm actually a SICE alum, but currently I work at Development Alternatives and manage a big Feed the Future investment in Bangladesh. And I have two questions. Well, I have like a dozen questions, but I'll do two. The first is, okay, deal. I was wondering, what kind of groundwork do you and your team do to prime that pipeline of private sector innovative ideas before you start receiving concept papers from the local private sector? Because I've found like it takes quite a bit of prep work and strategizing to pull those ideas out of the woodwork. So I was wondering if what your approach is to that. And my second question, I'm like trying to pick, is what kind of capacity are you bringing to the table to do those the business plan developments? Because it seems like a totally different capacity than that maybe doesn't exist on the project teams as they stand before you start an accelerator like that.
Right,
do you know?
right.
Okay.
So let me answer the last one because you're going to have to remind me again on the first one. So the capacity for the business planning, what was important for us, because we're GAIN and we have to measure, we have to have similar methodologies across all of them to measure the impact of the marketplace as a collective, is we have KPMG that work with us and they work with the companies to shape their business plans. Okay, and it's really important that we have a similar methodology for the business planning to see how effective, you know, that design of those business plans is. In the end, the banks will do their own business planning, right? I mean, we take guidance from the bank, or these elements here, have you opened their books, do they have their accounts for the last 3 years, these kinds of questions. But in the end, the banks will do their own. But this gives them enough confidence to move to the next stage, the banks to the next stage. But it is done with a single global institution for the method. The first question is right. So before we open a marketplace for nutritious food, we do about 6 months worth of landscape. Some of that is addressing, let's just be sure we know what the burden of malnutrition is. If, for example, it's not protein, We don't see a big protein, energy, malnutrition problem, but we do see a lot of micronutrients. That will inform how we screen some of the products that are coming through the marketplace. So we do the nutrition screenings. But we also do a big inventory. What are the businesses working in these sectors that are currently there? And then as we invite, it's really interesting how the word of mouth, these things are growing really fast. We also make it very friendly to business. These meetings take place in the morning. They take before the business day. Companies are not going to want to spend their day sitting at a marketplace for nutritious foods convening. So they love having breakfasts, networking over breakfast. So we design it to be quite business friendly. And the word of mouth is what gets it out. I mean, I think the first call for proposals we had in Kenya, we expected maybe 60 or 70 proposals. We ended up with 280, right? And Kenya's a very dynamic, environment. Contrary in Tanzania, I think we had 40. So it really, the flavor, the dynamism of the markets is what's going to drive how fast it can expand.
So even though I know Bonnie, I'll introduce myself for the room. I'm Angie Steen, and I'm with Palladium. We're also an implementing partner of USAID, DFID, and DFAT. And my question is not the market-based solutions, but it's on the other model where you talked about the business-to-business relationship between the US or EU firm or European firm and then the local business. And I'm just curious to know what the draw is right now. What's the incentive for the Western business to be involved in this kind of thing so far?
No, good question. So it's very interesting. This will be launched first in Nigeria. That's been the request of the businesses. So they're looking for countries that are quite, that are up and coming and they can actually support these kinds of businesses. The incentive, though, is quite interesting. It's different because when you start to get, let's say, in cold chain or warehousing, you get those companies that are the service providers in cooling and cold chain and those companies that are actually building warehouses. The incentive for the service providers we're finding is completely CSR, right? So all philanthropic CSR. But for the warehousing companies, it's because they want to get business moving in Nigeria. So it's, the incentives will differ depending upon the service and an individual company. I think it would be really interesting, and maybe somebody in the room's looked at this, but those companies that are publicly traded versus privately held, the incentive for them to get involved in what are very risky ventures, I would be interested to see what people's observations are with that, because certainly shareholders now are becoming very aware of the social benefit of companies, and shareholders are holding companies to task much more than they used to on their social footprint. But yet, it's the privately held, the family-held companies that have much more freedom to operate and can do much more philanthropic kind of investment. But I don't know if anybody's had any experience in this and if they have any observations on publicly versus privately held companies and their ability to, or their willingness to engage. We've met. I think we did. Go ahead.
So my name's Yasmin. I'm an intern at IFPRI, and I have two questions. So I was wondering what kind of work GAIN does at the systems level to create buy-in from the government for agriculture for nutrition. Because I'm from Ghana, and I know that there's a lot of duplicity of activities at the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And so how are you incentivizing the Ministry of Food and Agriculture to ensure to create the right environment for farmers to actually be thinking about nutrition? And number two, with post-harvest losses, like you rightly mentioned, road systems are a hindrance to crops moving from the site of production to consumption. So also at the enabling environment, how are you getting the local governments and also the national governments to actually invest in access to roads, access to finance, things like that?
Right. So I'll talk about Nigeria because that's where we're launching the post-harvest loss and waste. We haven't done all the analysis in Ghana for that. The government of Nigeria has put a flag in the sand that post-harvest loss and waste is actually one of its priorities, so we didn't really need to do too much to convince, although, whether you can actually put money behind it is what matters. So there's a lot of willingness on paper. And we've also looked at other agricultural financing mechanisms that could be directed toward post-harvest loss and waste. So for example, the Central Bank of Nigeria has a fund, it's managed by a group called NIRSAL that sits within the Central Bank of Nigeria, that has been explicitly set up and supported by government to provide concessional financing to agricultural interventions, okay? This is not, nutrition is not what they're thinking about. That's gain. However, there is concessional financing that they can provide to businesses anywhere along food supply chains to reduce the cost of lending. So for example, a commercial loan in Nigeria is lent out at 24% interest rate. The concessional financing in Nigeria provided through NIRSAL is at 9%. So, and the government picks up the difference. So what will happen is the plan, the post-harvest loss and waste companies have an agreement with NIRSAL that they can get that preferred financing. So a bank that works with NIRSAL is part of our diagnostic team, and that bank then can go to NIRSAL to get the 9% rate and be able to finance that business to business at 9%. So that allows us, of course, it's a nice incentive for companies to come to the table. Sorry, the other half of your question.
Now I'm lost.
No, sorry.
So I talked about,
Oh, the government, the government. So in the case of Ghana in particular, we have not launched the marketplace there. There's interest in launching it. Ghana actually has been pretty good about linking agriculture with nutrition for many years. I mean, you've got some real nutrition leaders who see diets and work within the Ministry of Agriculture and Agriculture calling for health to sit at the table. And so we have to kind of take advantage of what has already been started. I have not done the landscape reviews in Ghana to know whether we can hook on to something that's already a policy that's in place. I have done some studies on rural farming women's, we've used focused ethnographic surveys to go into farming households and determine what is limiting mothers' ability to provide an adequate diet to infants in rural areas. And all our research was showing women's time burden was enormous, and that the diet, where she was sourcing her foods for her infants, et cetera. And we can come up with findings that the Ghanaian Health Service is actually quite interested in the findings because rural women are some of the poorest and the children are some of the poorest and undernourished. And these findings of what are the constraints for women to feed their infants have been very welcome into the Ghanaian Health Service to inform their food-based strategies and their food-based recommendations for rural women. And it actually has modified what were their generic national food-based recommendations. So again, it's really looking at the demand side and saying, what are her constraints? What are mom's constraints? And so Ghana it's quite a friendly country for agriculture and nutrition. Hi.
I heard several elements of it, but could you clarify? Oh, sorry. Hi guys, I'm Prem Mindraban. I work for the International Fertilizer Development Center. Just quickly, we would like to intervene with micronutrient fertilization to improve, let's say, the nutritional quality in crops that has
Prem and I have
collapsed.
talked about that Bangladesh project.
One question: how do you? I have heard bits and pieces, but how do you institutionalize all these developments? It sounds like a systems change in the entire society that you need to kind of catalyze. So do you go beyond these projects? And again, I said you gave some hints. Do you go beyond these projects to bring policy, banks, and all these different players together and to see what the overall benefits might be and how it can be more sustainably, let's say, scaled up in a country?
Yeah. So this does not typically, we always have government sitting at the table because they either regulate or they can provide incentive but a lot of times the private sector runs on its own. So these companies, the Marketplace of Nutritious Foods in Kenya, Mozambique, they're not requiring government intervention and they're running on their own. I think you find that in the United States as well. You don't need the government necessarily to have private sector be successful. So anyways, I don't know if that answers your question, but we engage with government because there's a need when it comes to food safety, when it comes to better regulatory environments around food. We do that through an alliance. We do it through the community of practice in the case of the marketplace. And in the case of the Post-Harvest Loss Alliance, government is one of the anchor partners. The ministry, it's the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, FMARD, in Nigeria. That's the anchor partner for policy. So they sit within the alliance and they participate. So there's always that dialogue going on. But beyond that, we don't ask for government intervention beyond, helping with the financing, for example. And then informing and helping the companies themselves meet the regulatory when they're in place. Does that help, Prem?
Well,
The systematization, I don't know what we have to build.
Well, the point is every country works differently, has different rules and regulations.
Right.
And it might be that the government would come up with incentives, let's say, for banking.
Right.
We just heard about infrastructure. So each and every player will have a specific role to play, and it will be different in different countries. So my question is actually, are you catalyzing a national process? So not always come from outside and intervene, etc. A national process where the actors themselves sit down and discuss about these different interventions to scale
Sure.
up this kind
So
of issue.
it's the Post-Harvest Loss Alliance for Nutrition. So there's an alliance in Nigeria made up of government, research organizations, business associations.
Differently then, apart from your projects, do you see other developments going on in that area?
Interesting. Not trying to bring the private sector in as much.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
According to the new Access to Nutrition Index report, Ajinomoto, for example, is very active
In Ghana, yeah.
and has declared that it is going to improve nutrition through its work. The assessment was not able to figure out how the hell they were doing this, but at least they stated this as a matter of policy and commitment. So you have to figure there was some sort of, long-term commitment to building a market in nutritious products
And we work with Ajinomoto,
for
actually.
that example.
Right, for fortified and complementary foods and for this Cocoa Plus product.
Unilever, Danone, a lot of the big companies externally are actually engaging in Nigeria for exactly
Right.
the reasons that you've said, because they feel that there's a huge market for fruit juice, Nestle, or soup, or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, and I shouldn't overlook, I don't know if you're all familiar with the SUN, the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. There is a whole wing of that's called the SUN Business Network, where government is looking to catalyze business involvement in nutrition and nutritious food systems. I believe DFID has just given a bunch of money to Mozambique and working with the government to catalyze business for nutritious foods. Believe it's focused on school feeding programs. But at any rate, so there are these global movements that I think are more trying to systematically bring in bilateral funding with government funding to get things moving. I think where we're uniquely sitting, at least from the marketplace examples, is we recognize that 95% of food is sourced from small and medium-scale enterprises in Africa. Now, maybe that's changing. We're seeing, the supermarketization. But in fact, it's still very true that most of Africa is eating from small and medium-scale enterprises. And those folks need help in getting better foods into the food system. So that's just the reality that we work within. And so maybe it's this small and medium scale component that isn't necessarily shifting systems, or we're not seeing it as shifting systems, but we're getting a lot of portions into the market. I think our next stage and our challenge for GAIN is to measure that in terms of consumption. We at GAIN, we're a nutrition organization, right? So we want to really take a look at how the availability translates to better consumption and nutritional status in the household, and how that actually is reducing the cost for the base of the pyramid population.
Thanks. So this actually builds off your last point. My name is Marie Spiker. I'm a doctoral student in human nutrition at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And I was really struck by what you said, that nutrition's not about food, because largely it's not, and that's one of the frustrations I have with my own discipline. And so I was really pleased to see that you discussed impact in terms of the number of portions of these nutrient-rich foods that are entering the marketplace. And from sort of the therapeutic nutrition community, the indicator that people want to see is stunting. Like, what's the impact on stunting and nutritional status? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what can we do to meet in the middle. Like, clearly there is something in between portions available in the marketplace and something so distal such as stunting, and how can we shift that conversation towards indicators that have more to do with the foods that people are consuming?
Right. No, this is the biggest challenge I think we face, is how to measure this. And I come from agriculture. So, you know, as soon as stunting got on the radar screen as the indicator for nutrition, you know, all of us Aggies sort of cringed, right? Because there's no single food. I mean, even the lovely orange flesh sweet potato, which we know is going to deliver all of the vitamin A that you're going to need, is not going to have an impact on stunting, right? And it's all of this. It's that there's food and then there's infection and disease, right? This infection and disease is not going to be met through classic nutrition interventions. So you've got to bring in the wash. You've got to bring in everything that will impact on that disease. I think that stunting is, agriculture won't go there. I think it's really too much to ask agriculture to go there. And I think, quite frankly, agriculture is enormous and nutrition is minuscule. I mean, this is my own personal opinion. And agriculture can and will walk away from these indicators. So I think you need to be very careful. If you want to put the power of agriculture behind nutrition, we have to give them something they can measure and that they can be successful with. And so for me, the closest we've gotten is dietary diversity scores. That's what we have, that's what's validated, right? We've validated in infants, in children, and we've validated in women, but we haven't validated at the household level. So we need to have these indicators that agriculture can say, hey, we move the needle, and we'll continue to help you invest in this. But they're busy people. They're dealing with climate change, they're dealing with changes in pests, they're dealing with, you know, all kinds of massive disruptions in the food system. And we need to keep them engaged by giving them something they can measure, and stunting is not it. That's my opinion.
Kate Howard, Save Consulting. Thank you very much. I had two quick questions. One on the market, on the applications to the marketplace. How was the breakdown on gender for both submissions and selection? And then the second question is a bit more of a bit vaguer. At the end game in the marketing and the developing, as you've graduated out your applicants, what effort is there, if any, to connect any of these success stories toward other types of programs within countries, such as national school feeding programs? USDA has an absolute concrete proposal that countries graduate. WFP has an absolute concrete status that, in theory, countries graduate. Bangladesh is on its way to graduation in theory and has a huge national school feeding program. Kenya also. And I'm just curious if that has any applicability to the market program that you're adapting.
Yeah. So gender, I don't have that data, but it's one of the screening tools we use. We definitely collect it. I don't have it. I can send it to you. It will vary. You know, I think we're finding that when it, just as an observation, when it comes to the raw and fresh commodities, the higher value they are, they're more male. The fortified complementary foods, some of the processed foods, the peanut butter products, the things, they tend to be more female-owned, but that's just a generalization. I'd want to get back to you on the exact data. In terms of linking these companies into bigger businesses, right? So I know there's a lot of discussion, and I've been in discussions with WFP and the GCNF to do local procurement of, in this one case, it's mango products for school feeding programs as a snack. They're kind of fruit roll-ups. And so we've done, or we're considering, if it's a big enough pool of companies, we're first having to do a survey of the companies that could do this, of doing a specific call for proposals for school feeding programs, for foods to go into school feeding programs. We haven't been that targeted because, quite frankly, we need quite a pipeline to run one of these. If we've got just 2 or 3 companies, it makes the whole investment in running the pipeline and screening it's quite expensive per company to run it. But there is more work we could do to point these companies to institutions. We have one company that dries tomatoes and mangoes that has put together a product to feed, I believe it's the military, with a mix. It's like a mix you can add to ugali, for those who know ugali. It's dried, so they're dried fruits and dried vegetables in this case that you can add to the ugali, the mixed. So you've got some veg and ugali, and that's quite a customer. So he has been able to start to develop a prototype for that very large institutional buyer. Of course, banks love that, right? So they're willing, much easier to lend to him because he has that customer on board. Sure. So the mango is a good example, right? So mango is very regional. The zone for mango is in Kwale, so it's in southeastern Kenya.
Yes, hi, Erica Catron from Land O'Lakes International Development.
I'm supposed to meet you.
So I had actually a linguistic sort of question. Language is very important as we try to bring different stakeholders together. And I find that the food systems term really rests with the nutrition people, sometimes with the ag community, and not at all resonant with the sort of access to finance community, which tends to think about market systems. So how would you sort of differentiate or define between food systems and market systems?
I haven't found the need to do that. I've had the found to need do exactly what you're talking about, distinguish between supply chains and ag systems and food systems, because agriculture tends to stop at the farm gate. I mean, I know I went to ag school, I took soils classes, I took animal husbandry, I took horticulture, but no one talked to me about processing, no one talked to me about packaging or transport or refrigeration. So I've found, even at GAIN right now, we're in the middle of a discussion that I'm no longer the Director of Agriculture and Nutrition, but I'm the Director of Food Systems. Because that is the language that is now at least being adopted, at least within the bylaw. I don't know if, Emmy, that's your experience too, that the food system vernacular is coming in much more. Much more. And it's much more useful, as far as I'm concerned. But I haven't had to make this jump. I think that the finance folks that I've dealt with have worked with agricultural finance. So they're maybe not demanding that we do that as much, and they get food systems and investments within food systems.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Katie Pogue. I'm a student here at SAIS in Jessica's class. What struck me when you talked about that people eat diets, I immediately thought about the fact that people also cook diets, and this model seems predicated on the belief that if you increase availability, decrease cost of nutritious foods, that people will eat and consume them. And some of these products seem, quite technologically advanced and probably new to some communities. Can you speak some of the challenges of then increasing consumption at the end of the line of these nutritious foods? And is there an element of nutrition education involved?
So there isn't, at this, with the exception that every company has a marketing strategy, right? So they're trying to get at the consumer. However, in Mozambique, there has been a request for us to add on a public campaign to put color on your plate, right? So to diversify your diet, so it actually generates the demand. We're trying to figure out how we can measure the impact of that campaign on the uptake of some of these, so we have to figure out the indicators. But there's a clear call to do just that. That you could, some of us may remember in the United States those public service announcements with, I'm dating myself, but to stop pollution, and there was, all kinds of pollution types of public service announcements that were very emotive. And so there's a call for us to try to do some of those big public service campaigns around diversifying your diet and putting color on your plate, yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see all the familiar faces.
I think we have one last one.
Oh, one last one.
Maybe just one last one. You had talked about the blended financing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you could talk about what varieties of blended financing you've seen. And maybe I could share a couple of examples that I've seen as well. But I would like to hear from.
Yeah, so when I talk about blended financing, we also do sort of, there's like first loss capital that's going on, and I'm not a financing person. There's all kinds of credit facilities that can be established with all these concessional loan rates. But it's needing to bring the public money to the table as collateral, essentially, in order for the private lending to kick in. If you can provide enough collateral in, then you'll end up getting more, they're more amenable. But we've found that there's some similar engines that have had success if they have this access to some sort of capital that they can show as collateral to the banking system. I'm not a financing person, and I know that they're extremely creative, these people. We just had a big meeting with a whole bunch, and we're having one in New York next week, but we should share more information on some of that, and on what you've seen and what you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also not a financing person, but I just joined a team that is very into it. And for example, in Ghana, they have a project called FinGap. And I know that it's USAID funding, but for every $1 that USAID will put in, they're able to leverage like $30 from these corporations, and it's all agribusiness.
Yeah.
And so now USAID has said, okay, well, because this has been so successful, and it's actually clearly very easy to leverage this private financing, now we're going to raise the bar to like 100 to 1. So it is really kind of interesting. But
yeah.
the other piece of it, though, is sometimes when you have these instruments that USAID will offer, like the Development Credit Authority, which is supposed to be a loan guarantee to make it less risky for a bank to get involved in agro-financing. But what's interesting is in some countries, I understand that they've had to be canceled because there's just lack of uptake among agribusinesses or MFIs. They just don't want to get into it. And it could be this issue of collateral. I'm not sure. For me, it's still an unanswered question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the microfinance is a very difficult area. I mean, the companies we work with are often called the missing middle because they're too large for microfinance, but they're too small for commercial lending. They're this place that really needs public investment in order to kick them and be commercially viable. So we're finding we're really having to work within that space, and that's where we can be using this public money to attract more private sector investment. I have to do a commercial. There's a great report out there. I was asked to write this report about a year ago on cultivating nutritious food systems. I think it looks through the whole supply chain, and it says all the way from seed, and I know Prem, I even have talked about the use of micronutrient fertilizers in improving nutrition, and all the way through the food system. So it just gives you examples of some of the good work that's going on around the world to bring nutrition into better food systems. So thanks.